Today's story marked by darkness. Hi, I'm Joseph, 35, male, and I'm married to Heather. We've been together for 5 years now, and life has been pretty steady. I work as a software engineer, and Heather's a teacher. We live in a quiet neighborhood, and up until recently, things were going well. But I've always considered myself a rational guy, never believed in ghosts or curses. All that changed after what happened with Heather and her best friend, Gwen. It started 2 weeks ago, on the way to Gwen's funeral. I've never considered myself a superstitious person. Ghosts, curses, and the paranormal always seemed like something out of a bad movie, the kind of stories people tell to make sense of things that don't have explanations. My rational mind dismissed them all as modern myths, ancient fears repackaged into something that could entertain or spook. But what I've been through recently has made me question all of that. Whether I believed in curses before doesn't seem to matter anymore. After all, just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it can't affect you. It started 2 weeks ago, on the way to Gwen's funeral. Gwen was my girlfriend Heather's best friend, and Heather had taken her sudden passing extremely hard. Gwen had died from a heart attack, completely out of the blue. She was only 34, perfectly healthy, or so we thought. It made no sense, and maybe that was why it hit Heather so hard. "I don't know if I can do this," Heather had said, wiping her tears for the third time since we left the house. I squeezed her hand gently, wishing I could say something that would make her feel better, but there were no magic words to fix this kind of thing. "It's going to be tough, but we'll get through it together," I told her, knowing full well how hollow those words sounded. It was all I had. I didn't know Gwen that well. We'd only met a handful of times, but Heather had always spoken highly of her. She was shattered, and all I could do was be there for her. When we arrived at the funeral home, the sky looked like it was on the verge of breaking. Clouds hung low and thick, a gloomy backdrop for an already grim day. Heather took a deep breath, steeling herself, and I followed her inside. The place was filled with mourners, all dressed in black, their faces drawn with grief. It was a small town, and Gwen was well loved by everyone. We approached Gwen's parents to pay our respects, and Heather nearly broke down again. Her tears never seemed to stop, but somehow, she held it together long enough to make it through the line. After a few minutes, we were ushered toward the room where Gwen's body was on display. The viewing was already underway. I wasn't sure what to expect. I had been to a few funerals before, but this one felt different. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, and not just with grief. There was an odd energy, something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was just the sadness of the day weighing on me, or maybe it was the two figures near the casket that caught my eye. They were dressed in religious robes, holding crucifixes, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. It seemed strange, but I brushed it off. It was a funeral, after all. People cope in different ways. Heather didn't seem to notice them. She was focused entirely on Gwen. She walked up to the coffin, tears streaming down her face, and gently placed her hand on Gwen's. I stayed back, giving her some space. As I looked down at Gwen, I felt a strange wave of emotion. It wasn't grief, not exactly, but something deeper. Something darker. For a brief moment, the air felt like it was buzzing, as if the room itself was alive with an angry energy. The pressure in my head built up, like my ears were about to pop, but there was no sound to explain it. Then I noticed something strange about Gwen's hand, the one Heather was holding. Her fingers had scratches on them. At first, they were hard to see under the funeral makeup, but the closer I looked, the clearer they became. Deep, irregular scratches, like someone had dragged their nails across her skin. It didn't seem right, but before I could say anything, Heather flinched and pulled her hand back. "Ow!" she gasped, looking down at her own hand. Her finger was bleeding, a small but deep cut forming on the tip. What the hell? I didn't feel anything. I grabbed some tissues from a nearby table and helped her press them against the cut. "You okay? Did you catch it on something?" Heather shook her head, her face pale. "No, I was just holding her hand. That's all." Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. Another group of mourners was waiting to come in, so we stepped aside. I wrapped Heather's finger in a bandage from the car's first aid kit, but the whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. We moved into the main hall for the service. But Heather wasn't doing well. She was pale, her eyes unfocused, and she kept rubbing her temples. "It's just a migraine," she whispered to me, but I could see she was in a lot of pain. "You sure?" "Maybe we should go," I said, concerned. Heather hated migraines. When she got one, it usually wiped her out for the rest of the day. "No, I need to stay, for Gwen." She winced, clutching her head again. I wasn't convinced, but before I could argue, she stood up, pulling me along with her. "We have to go now," she said, her voice strained. Without waiting for me to respond, she started making her way toward the exit. As we hurried out of the hall, I saw the two robed figures again. They were standing near the doorway, watching us with strange, almost fearful expressions. As we passed, I swear I heard one of them mutter something in Latin. It sounded like maledictionum, but I couldn't be sure. Outside, the sky finally gave in, unleashing a torrential downpour. Heather leaned against the car, looking like she was about to pass out. "I can't stay," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. I said my goodbye. "We have to go." I drove us home through the storm, trying to focus on the road while keeping an eye on Heather. She was shivering, but not from the cold. Her right hand, the one that had touched Gwen, was clenched in her lap, and she kept rubbing it like it was bothering her. "You okay?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "My head, it hurts so much," she whispered, barely able to keep her eyes open. We finally made it home, and Heather went straight to bed. I sat by her side for a while, listening to the rain pounding against the windows, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Something was wrong, more than just grief. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by Heather screaming. I rushed upstairs, heart pounding, and found her sitting up in bed, her face pale and drenched in sweat. She was clutching her hand, the same one that had been cut. "What's wrong?" I asked, but she didn't seem to hear me. She was muttering to herself, her voice frantic. "I'm sorry, Gwen. I didn't know. Please, not me. Not us." I reached out to comfort her, but she recoiled, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't touch me!" she screamed, her voice filled with a fear I had never heard from her before. I stepped back, stunned. She had never looked at me like that before. Slowly, her breathing calmed, and she collapsed back onto the pillow, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, watching her, waiting for anything to make sense. The next day, Heather's fever spiked. She was delirious, barely able to form coherent sentences, and the cut on her finger had deepened. I tried to call her parents, but the phone line was dead. I tried her sister, too. Nothing. It felt like we were completely cut off, alone in the middle of this storm. By the third day, things had gotten much worse. Heather's fever was dangerously high, and she refused to take any medicine. She barely recognized me, constantly muttering things about Gwen, about curses, about something I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, she went completely still. I called 911. I tried to do CPR. Nothing worked. When they took her body away, I noticed something strange. My own hand, the one I had used to try and shake her awake, had a small scratch on the index finger. The cut was eerily similar to the one Heather had, and before that, Gwen. Now, as I sit here trying to make sense of all this, I realize the word I heard that day, maledictionum, wasn't just some strange Latin phrase. It meant curse. And I can't shake the feeling that, somehow, it's not over. Let's move to our next story named The House at Blackwater Bend. Hi, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm 26, a freelance writer, and recently moved to a small, remote town in northern Maine. It's quiet here, isolated, which is exactly what I thought I needed. I came here to focus on finishing my novel, away from the distractions of city life. I rented an old house by the river, far from any neighbors, hoping the solitude would help my creativity flow, but I think I made a mistake. It all started on the 8th night. I never should have taken that house. I should have known from the moment I saw the crooked for rent sign half buried in weeds that there was something wrong. But I was desperate. I wanted to finish my novel and needed solitude, a place where the only sound would be the rustling of trees and the occasional call of a bird. Blackwater Bend seemed perfect. It was miles from the nearest neighbor, perched on a hill overlooking a wide, slow-moving river. The house itself was ancient, its wooden walls warped and creaky, but it had a kind of charm that spoke to me. I told myself I wasn't afraid. The first week was fine. I wrote during the day, took walks in the woods, and sat by the river in the evenings. The water was cold and still, dark like ink. But I liked it. It made me feel small, insignificant, like the world had forgotten me, and for a while, I found comfort in that. Then, on the 8th night, I woke up to the sound of dripping. I thought it was just the faucet, a loose pipe maybe. Groggy, I dragged myself out of bed and padded down the narrow hall to the kitchen. The floorboards groaned under my weight. The house was always groaning like it was tired, like it had borne too much. When I reached the kitchen, the sound stopped. I checked the sink. Dry. I shrugged and started back toward my room, but as I turned to leave, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. There, in the reflection of the window above the sink, I saw her. A figure. Pale. Still. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the yard. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, heart thudding hard in my chest. It was too dark to make out details, but she was there, I was sure of it. Just standing. Watching, I blinked, and she was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out at the empty yard, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen anything. Eventually, I returned to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I told myself it was just a trick of the light. I'd been half asleep, after all, and the mind plays strange games in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that followed me throughout the day. I sat at my desk, staring at the blank page. Unable to focus. My mind kept drifting back to the window, to that figure. That night, it happened again. The dripping woke me, and I went to the kitchen, almost on instinct. And there she was, standing just at the edge of the woods, closer this time. I could see her more clearly now, long, tangled hair, a white dress that fluttered in the windless night. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I turned away from the window, heart racing, forcing myself to breathe. When I looked back, she was gone. For the next few days, I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the page, the shadow of that figure lingering in the back of my mind. I didn't dare go out to the yard. The woods, once inviting, now seemed like a barrier, hiding her, waiting. It wasn't until the 4th night that things got worse. The dripping woke me, just like before, but this time, I didn't go to the kitchen. I lay in bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, listening. Drip. 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 It was louder now, like it was coming from inside the room. I forced myself to sit up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The moonlight filtered in through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. And there, at the foot of my bed, was a puddle of water. I stared at it, unblinking, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. How could there be water? There was no leak, no pipe near the room. My heart raced as I followed the trail of droplets with my eyes up the bedpost, up the sheets. And then I saw her. She was standing right next to me. Her face was inches from mine, her eyes wide and hollow, her skin pale and waterlogged. Her lips were blue. Cracked, as if she had been submerged in water for days. She didn't move. She just stood there, dripping. I screamed. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was alone in my bed. The puddle was gone, but the sheets were still damp. I called the landlord that morning, demanding to know if the house had a history, if something had happened here. At first, he was reluctant to talk, but I pushed. Finally, he told me about the girl. Her name was Lily. She had lived in the house years ago, back when the town was more populated. One night, she wandered into the woods and drowned in the river. They found her body weeks later. Bloated and waterlogged, her skin pale and cracked. No one knew why she went into the water. Some said she had been sleepwalking. Others said something had drawn her there. After her death, strange things started happening at the house. The family moved out, and it had stood empty ever since. I wanted to leave, but something held me there. I can't explain it. I should have packed my bags and left that very day, but I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something more sinister. The final night, I woke not to the sound of dripping, but to the sound of footsteps. slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the hall. My body went cold. I couldn't move. The door creaked open, and I saw her standing in the doorway. She stepped inside, her wet feet leaving dark prints on the wooden floor. She came closer, and I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen. She leaned over me, her breath cold against my skin, her eyes locked on mine. Then she spoke, "You're next." I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up outside, by the river, the morning sun filtering through the trees. My clothes were soaked, my skin clammy. I left that day. I didn't even pack. I just drove, and I didn't stop until I was miles away, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the dripping again. It's faint, but it's there, echoing in the back of my mind. I don't think I'll ever be rid of her, not until she finds someone else.